Okay, so welcome to Rail Engineering with Georgia Thompson from BAM Nuttall. Hi, Georgia.
Hiya, how are you?
I'm very well, thank you. First question, what route did you take into engineering?
I took quite a typical route. So I did A levels and I chose maths, history, and physics.
Yep.
I chose economics in my first year, but I didn't do too well, so I dropped it and carried
Right.
those three. And then I went to university and studied civil engineering at the University of
Right.
Portsmouth. So that's kind of the route I took into the engineering industry.
Right. So how did you become involved in the rail industry?
So in my first job, I was in a graduate scheme, so I was able to rotate around the business. Originally, I wasn't meant to do a placement in rail, so I
Right.
did a design placement. I really enjoyed the rail environment. My next placement was to work in energy, but I wasn't really enjoying it, so I discussed with the HR who were looking after my graduate scheme, and I really asked, could I be transferred into the rail department because I
Right.
think
Okay.
I'd really enjoy it. So that's how I initially got into it.
Right.
Again, as part of the graduate scheme, you move around. So I moved around again. And when it finished, I wasn't able to go back into rail. However, I really enjoyed rail. So I looked for a new job that would more align with what I wanted to do and
Right.
made sure that it was in rail. So that's how
Yeah.
I got back into the rail industry.
So did you move companies to take that rail job?
Yeah, so my
Right.
company had rail, but the type of engineering they were doing was more electrical.
Right.
And I wanted to work more on the civil side of the business, and they
Yeah.
didn't have facilities. So I looked for a company that did.
Right. Okay. So generally, how long do you spend out on site and how long do you spend in the office?
So depend on the role. So for my role, being design coordinator, you're in between the site teams and the design teams. So I often move from design office to client office to site. So it varies, but I always try at least once a month to be on
Right.
site.
Yeah.
I could do it weekly, depends on how busy my schedule is.
Yeah.
But I do always make sure that I go at least once or twice a month
Right.
to be on site. And then during construction phases, I'll probably pick it up and go once a week, definitely during while they're actually constructing.
Yeah. So is that like typical for like what your job is, engineering, or do people spend longer on site or shorter on site, or what
So,
you do?
so depending on your role, so I work for a contractor, which is typically the companies that build the infrastructure and build the designs. So there is many roles like site engineer where you'll be placed on site most
Right.
of the time.
Yes.
Um, Again, sometimes when you're mobilizing between different jobs, there might be a period where you have to work in the office for a couple of weeks or a couple of months, depending on what the demand is. But
Yeah.
typically, and also railway is a lot of weekend working,
Yes.
so that you get the time to actually work on infrastructure and build. So a lot of it's on the weekend where
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
really get stuck in. So
Yeah.
during the week, you might be in the office, but if you're a site engineer, you would be on site most of, if not all the time.
Yeah.
But if you're a designer, so design engineer, but in the rail industry, you would mostly be in the office and you'll probably go for a survey maybe once a month, maybe, if
Right.
you're lucky.
So what's it actually like to spend time on site on the railways? What's it like working on the railways?
I really enjoy it. You get a lot of different characters, very animated characters sometimes.
Yeah.
So everyone's typically always up for a laugh, and everyone's quite welcoming.
Yeah.
During actually, when works are happening, a lot, you work as a team to get things done. So,
Yeah.
a lot, you have this whole really team relationship. So you're working with people all the time. You're outside, walking up and down on ballast. So that's the real stuff.
Yes.
So it could be a little bit of a workout. But you're always passing different characters, different people. There's so
Yeah.
many people that work on the railway. You'll be walking past, oh, I know you. Da-da-da-da-da.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's nice. You do get the odd days where it's raining and it's cold and
Yeah.
very windy. But as long as it's not raining, it's always nice. And we are waterproof. I get
Yeah.
told that quite a bit. So yeah, it's nice to be outside sometimes, not just cooped up in the office sitting down. So that's what
Yeah.
I like. working outside.
Can it be quite physically challenging though? I mean, I know when I've been out on site in the railways, you know, the access to the railways can be few and far between to where your site is, and it can involve an awful lot of walking. It can take you, you know, an hour to get to a site. So, you know, so can that sometimes just take it out of you? Is it quite physically demanding?
Well, yeah, walking on ballast is not easy. It's definitely a workout, and I think when you are part of the planning process is looking at access points, looking at where
Yeah.
you're trying to get to, and if you can, and if it's possible, trying to do a temporary access, so temporary stairs
Yeah.
is always something that could be considered. But when you're a mile away, it can get tiring, but
Yeah.
it's not, you don't do it all the time, so it's not like every single day you're walking miles and miles and miles.
Yeah.
It's always nice as you walk to have a little chat. So
Yeah. So there's obviously lots of health and safety procedures involved in working on the railways. Can you tell us the importance of the H&S on railways?
Well, yeah, definitely. With on the railway, you have a lot of different infrastructure. You have electricity cables. There's a lot of things that could potentially cause harm to you.
Yeah.
So it's very important that every individual that goes on the railway is aware of all the risks and all the potential things that can cause harm to you. So
Yeah.
for the railway, as a minimum, typically you would need a PTS, which is, I don't actually know what it is, to be honest. I think it's a personal track something,
Personal track
but
safety?
possibly, yes. So that's basically a foundation that's the minimum that everyone needs to know to go on the railway. And what that
Right.
involves is a 2-day course. So you've got to go on a 2-day course.
Right.
Prior to the course, you've got to do a test, and you've got to revise for the test. And that's the first thing you will do when you arrive. And if you fail it, you have to go home and you have to come back and do it again.
Right.
So it tells you about distances away from track, where you are and aren't allowed, things you can and cannot do. So it also identifies different areas, how to make an emergency call if you see an obstruction on the track. People travel on the trains, so it's very important that you're not just looking after your own safety, but you look after other people as well.
Yeah. So I guess in rail there's a lot of night shifts involved because you obviously have to close lines and temporarily for maintenance work and such like. So how do you prepare yourself for, say, working from 11 o'clock at night till 4 o'clock in the morning? Is it difficult?
Well, it can be. So if it's during the week, for example, if you're going to do a night shift on a Wednesday night, you would leave work early that day, so you wouldn't do a full day at work and then go out for a night shift.
Right.
Probably leave about midday, and I try to have a nap. So I try to don't drink any coffee that day.
Yeah.
Really try and have a nap before I go out, because you can be out, and the thing is traveling to site, so depending how you get there, there's also a lot of fatigue issues that the railway industry is very aware of.
Yeah.
So you have a minimum of you can't travel more than 2 hours to work.
Right.
You have is it 2 hours, 1 or 2 hours, I can't remember.
Right.
But yeah, I don't typically live that far, but yeah.
Yes, I know
So
what you mean. Yeah.
so you have to make sure that you get enough sleep, you get enough rest, and
Yeah.
then the next day you wouldn't go into work either, you'd have a rest day.
Right. Okay.
The other thing about working on night shifts is typically the last train probably come in about 1 o'clock, depending on the area, but you need to be on site earlier than that, because you do your briefings, and you got to wait for the last train to go through. You got to wait for the someone called the ECO, so I think he's the electrical control officer, and
Right.
he makes sure the signaller is making sure that the electricity is turned off. And then when you go on site, you got to make sure you got to do some tests to make sure that it is off,
Right.
because that is one of the most safety things. And then sometimes you have to get off track early, so you might say, okay, you're going to be there till 4 o'clock, but depending on who's in control of that track at the time, they might ask you to come off earlier.
Right.
So yeah, and then the next day you sleep all day, and then try not to sleep too much, so you can't go to sleep at night, and you just got to work with your sleep.
Right. So, if I was looking for work in the rail industry, what sort of companies should I be looking at contacting or looking at job adverts for?
So the rail industry has like massive supply chain. So depending on the kind of role that you want to do, there's so many different companies. A lot of companies have rail departments.
Yeah.
The Network Rail is the main client in the UK that does railways, and they have a supply chain, a particular supply chain that's certified to work with them. So what I would recommend is, you know, looking at Network Rail themselves as a
Right,
as an
okay.
opportunity.
Yeah.
Looking at their website, looking for any of their news stories. In their news stories, I would have companies, you know, like Bam Nuttall,
Yeah.
on their Twitter and saying, oh, you know, working with this company, working with that company. And then by looking at, I guess, the company that supplies the work, they will give you opportunities or just names, even
Right.
if it's just names. You can
Yeah.
go out and look at their websites.
Yeah.
But then don't limit it to that either. Because you have very more specialist companies that might do only a little bit of work with Network Rail, who isn't their main client. So
Right.
there's a lot of digging you need to do. I'd say looking at all construction companies, because Network Rail is such a massive client, everyone loves to shout that they work for them.
Yeah.
So there's definitely been some stuff about that.
Yeah. So obviously there's different routes into rail for young people and students, apprenticeship routes and graduate routes with graduate schemes. Can you tell us a little bit about each of those?
So you have graduate roles. So graduate roles is more typically for people that come out of university.
Yeah.
So you can have a number of different graduate roles, and that could be in consultancy, so more design side. It could be transport planning as well, so
Right.
more of the, I guess, the bigger picture, looking at. So, for example, like HS2, that would have massive transport planning bit in, and basically, as part of the graduate scheme, you would learn how to be an engineer in the rail industry. You know, you'd learn from other people, and you'll pick up certain skills and qualifications.
Yeah.
You can also go through an apprenticeship route. So apprenticeship routes now, you have varying different types. So you have, you know, the apprenticeship university route, where you work for a company, and depending on the apprenticeship you're on, you might go for a day release.
Yeah.
So once you go to university, or you might do the ones where you work for 3 or 4 months, go to uni for 3 months, and then work again for a few months. So you have those types, and those ones are much more replacing typical graduate schemes in universities. So with apprenticeship, you don't have to go to university.
No.
And you have the apprenticeship levy, which, you know, companies have to dedicate a certain percentage of their turnovers to apprenticeships. So I'd recommend definitely looking at the apprenticeship route if you're very clear about, you know, you want to work in a certain industry. Apprenticeships give you a really good start. Making that journey into engineering.
Yeah. So what's the worst part for you working in the rail industry? And don't say there isn't one. There's got to be a part you really don't like.
Perfect. What is the worst part? I think working in the office.
Right.
Yeah, for me personally, is being stuck in the office, which doesn't typically happen too much, but it can happen depending on your role. So me personally, I could never be a designer.
Right.
Designers are people that, you know, work in the same place every single day, and I couldn't do that. So that's something that I did learn during my time, that I can't be in one place all day.
Okay.
The consistency just drives me crazy. So I think working in the office is the worst.
It's for you the worst bit. So then what's the best bit?
The best bit for me is being out on site. I love being able to like see things happen. So over the Christmas, I was able to spend about 5 days out on site watching a bridge reconstruction.
Right.
I always try and get myself out to those. And yeah, I love being able to, you know, watch the development of something, look at it on a piece of paper, then look up and see it in real life. You see something go, and then you see a new thing come back, and it's like, wow, like this is pretty cool. So I love being out watching things happen.
So a bit of a more of a general question really now for the students is what tips would you give somebody to help their CV maybe stand out in such obviously a crowded marketplace. You know, have you got any tips that you could suggest?
Yeah, I think for your CV, I think it's really important to make sure that you are not too descriptive. So if you've had any voluntary experience, I think I'd recommend put it on there. Even if it's, you know, at school or at college,
Yeah,
helping organize an event at college is very valuable in terms of, you know, your organization skills, team working skills, things like that. So I think it's really important to list your skills, not necessarily be very descriptive. So
right.
don't say I did this, I did this, I did this. Say I was, you know, pragmatic, or, you know, I was very organized. You know, start to list your qualities.
Yeah,
And look at the different types of things that you do. Like even playing a sport, that shows a lot of commitment, dedication, and teamwork, which is very important skills when you work
yeah,
in the working environment.
yeah, yeah. And finally, what interview tips would you give to a young person? Obviously, you know, young people don't have many interviews. So,
Yes.
you know, what tips would you give somebody to help them in one of their first interviews, say, for a position?
I'd say definitely prepare. So you can be nervous when, you know, you're in a situation you've never been in before. That is
Yeah,
typical to everybody. But the more you prepare, so if you're looking at, if you're going for a company and you're going to an interview, research that company, understand their goals, their values, look at the role that you applied for,
yeah,
and really understand it, and make sure you ask questions. So even if, you know, it's a question like, you know, how long have you worked here for, you know, get some sort of insight to the company that you're working for, because it shows the interviewer that you're
yeah,
interested. It's not
yes,
just, oh, I just applied. You know, you want to know more, you want to understand what the job is. And I think as an interviewer, understanding that that person's taken a lot of time and they haven't just applied for something, they know what it is. You know, you have a bit of a background understanding and a knowledge about what it's like to be an engineer, for example.
yeah, yeah,
So yeah, I think research helps with the nerves as well. Because
yeah,
if you get asked a question and you've done the research, it's like, oh my gosh, yeah, I did it. It's like a
yeah,
test, you know, it's like an exam. You know, sometimes you know it, but if you don't, you know, look it up, revise it, then yeah, treat it like an exam.
yeah. And do you think it's important to have a question for the interview? You know, a lot of interviewers ask, you know, at the end after you've had a discussion, have you got any questions for me? And it's always one of those. Sometimes it's like, you've answered all my questions, or do you think you should have? Do you think you need a question?
I don't think you need a question. I think that it's important to have a question,
Yeah,
because it's not just about you wanting to work for them. You also need to know if you want to work for this company. You
yeah,
know, is
yeah,
this
yeah,
company right for you?
yeah,
I think when you first start out, you just want a job. You know, when I was first applying, I applied for so many different jobs. I just wanted a job,
yeah,
but after time, and in, you know, hindsight's 2020, but looking back, I was very fortunate that I was able to choose a role where it was best suited to my skills.
yes,
You know, if I actually ended up working in a design office, I probably wouldn't be in engineering right now, because I would hate it. I think this
yeah,
isn't for
yeah,
me. So that research is something that I didn't do, but I would always recommend that, because, you know, even just asking what's a typical day like, who would I be working with? Would I be working with the interviewer, or is it
yeah,
someone else I'd be working with?
yeah,
You know, understanding, just, I think even just to make yourself a little bit excited about it, you know,
sure,
finding out, oh, what kind of things would I be doing on a day to day? So you have
yeah,
that
yeah,
bit of enthusiasm as well. And yeah, I think that's why it's important, because it's not just about getting a job. It's about getting a job that you think you'll enjoy and that's right for you.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Georgia, thank you so much.
Oh, no
Great,
problem.
great to speak to you again.
Yeah, you too.
Thank
Thank you.
you.
And yeah, great. Thanks.
Thank you.